to episode 3 of Dean and Ben Talk Tech.
Hello, Dean. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well, thanks. How have you been the last couple of weeks? You've been traveling anywhere, thinking
Not
about
so
new
much.
stuff?
It's been a bit quieter, which, to be honest, is not entirely unwelcome. But as we wind down 2025, there's still a few things worth talking about, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've been on the road a lot. It feels like I've hardly been home for the last month. So I was at an event in Dallas a while back, run by Amplify, formerly the Metro Ethernet Forum, about network as a service, which was pretty useful. And they're doing some stuff on network APIs for the enterprise and carrier and AI data center market. Maybe touch on that later. And then I've been, before that in Fuse in Dublin, talking about Open RAN and Open Wi-Fi and stuff. And or somewhere else this week. I'm trying to remember where I was. Oh yeah, I was in Dubai last week at the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance. We'll talk more about that, and Wi-Fi Now events. So it's been pretty hectic recently.
I haven't done much events, to be honest. But I have been thinking about a lot of things in the last few weeks and days. One of those is that I'm working with some partners on approaching fiber operators with a tool set to address their take-up issues. So hopefully early in the new year, we'll have an offer that we can push to people who are struggling with fiber take-up, and there's quite a lot of those.
There's a lot going on. I've noticed all the talk about consolidation and M&A in the UK altnet market, and a lot of that's down to poor take-up and poor cash flow.
Yeah, and I think way too rosy and ambitious planning in the funding stage 10 years ago. But yeah, no, I agree. So that's been one thing. The other thing I've been looking into, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about it some more, is an initiative that, in a sense, it's a standards initiative called My Terms. I don't know if you've heard about this.
No.
It's basically, it's a really interesting flip over the relationship between users and people who use their data. And it's kind of a it flips over the relationship in the sense that basically the user decides who can use their data and on what terms. And I've always felt that these things should have been set up from the start, and it would be a lot easier now. But I think these guys have an interesting path to actually making it happen, but I need to dig in deeper and talk to some people to figure out the kind of realistic dynamics around this.
That sounds fascinating, although it immediately triggers off a whole set of questions of how do you deal with inferred data rather than hard data, and also is like what proportion of people actually have time to administer their data portfolio and try and work out how to sell it, price it, rent it.
So I think right now, because they are at the standards stage, it's not necessarily so much about tooling, but I do need to dig in deeper. So I'm just raising the topic now as something we will very likely discuss into the new year.
Yeah.
I was scheduled to speak to a US contact on this yesterday, but obviously this being Thanksgiving weekend, suddenly availability of anyone for anything has just disappeared.
I've seen the same thing. And one I think I'll pick up at another date is the stuff I'm doing with my and Andrew Collinson's Unthinkable Lab program of events, which we're now partnering with Telecom TV on that. But I'll catch up with that in the next one of these.
Okay.
But it's definitely an interesting thing I'd like to talk about. So
excellent. So listen, I mean, the big news in the last few weeks, I guess, or at least one of the most discussed pieces of news has been this opinion, I guess we can call it that, from the European Union policymakers on upper 6G spectrum. So this has been, and correct me if I'm wrong, a contentious point for a number of years now on, whether telcos or Wi-Fi should have priority use of these spectrum bands in the upper 6 gigahertz. Can you summarize the debate in a few words, just so that we know where we're standing?
Right. Okay. So 6 gigahertz band has been on the table for the last 5 years. It's actually 1.2 gigahertz of spectrum between about 5.9 and 7.1. And it all kicked off about 5-6 years ago when the US decided to make it all unlicensed and available to Wi-Fi or theoretically Bluetooth or unlicensed cellular, certainly at low power for initially indoor use, and then layered on an option for a slightly higher power use if you accessed a database to say, can I use this at this place at this time? This band has some what are called incumbents in it. So there's people with fixed links, some satellite stuff in there. It's used for Earth observation satellites. So it's not perfectly clean, but it's a big chunk of spectrum. And what's happened is it's been divided into upper and lower sections. In much of the world, the lower section has been already made, including Europe, been made available for low power indoor Wi-Fi. The upper part of the band is what's contentious, and it's about 700 megahertz, and you've got competing claims on it. So the cellular industry in much of the world would love to have this as high power exclusive license used for 5G and future 6G. In the US and Canada and Saudi Arabia and South Korea, that's not happening. It's already been made unlicensed for Wi-Fi. In Europe, there's a group called the Radio Spectrum Policy Group, RSPG, which is sort of tasked by the European Commission to work out what to do with it. And they've been noodling on this for, feels like forever now. And there's also another mandate to the bigger, not EU, but Europe level regulatory body called CEPT to do some of the technical work on it. What happened was a couple of weeks ago, RSPG finally issued an opinion after doing multiple rounds of consultation and essentially saying most of that upper part of the band they want to dedicate and auction for, probably auction or allocate for traditional 5G and future 6G. And there's a small section at the bottom which might be used for Wi-Fi, but it's waiting until see what happens in the end of 2027 with the World Radio Congress and what they do with another band and made it conditional. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in there about we need to protect the incumbents, and they vary in importance by country. But this is largely seen as a sort of 4-1 victory for the cellular industry. They wanted to get the whole band. They've got most of it in this, but this is an opinion. This isn't actually the regulation. This is the RSPG saying this is what we think should happen. And
so wait a minute, because you've written about this and you've outlined, which I thought was really interesting. You've outlined 3 kind of angles upon which this could be read. So there's a cynical angle, and there's kind of slightly more optimistic views as to what this means for various parties. Can you go through this very quickly?
So I read a post and I said, look, the three lenses you can look at is the one is the cynical, which is mostly because of not so much the regulators but the politicians, and I'll be upfront and say Germany is right in the frame on this, and the new German minister for so-called digital has essentially lent on the regulatory bodies and said, and other policymakers as well, and said, yeah, we know you've done all this technical work, but frankly, we think that cellular is a sovereign thing for the EU because of Nokia and Ericsson and Deutsche Telekom and Orange and Telefonica and so on. Therefore, and I can't remember if it was Letter or Draghi put in the report, therefore we should be prioritizing this for cellular, and we haven't got a European level Wi-Fi policy, so we don't care. So that's the cynical view, is that essentially this is a response to the politicians, and it's a bit of a cop-out and said, we don't care, just give it to cellular because it's politically expedient. The next one is, frankly, is more I call can kicking, is saying, look, there's a bunch of important other stuff that's going to happen over the next couple of years. We might be revising the digital decade targets. We've got the DNA coming up, which may or may not have something on spectrum harmonization. There's this World Radio Congress at the end of 2027, all the preparation for it. There's all the AI Act and AI stuff. And frankly, we'd quite like to look at how 6 gigahertz goes elsewhere in the world for Wi-Fi or cellular to see what the actual demand is, because we're really not sure. So we're going to put something out that we know everyone's going to argue about, and then we can actually let someone else make a decision later.
So what's the third view?
The third one is, look, we've been told that this needs to be mostly cellular, but if you look carefully in what we've written, there's a few Easter eggs. We're not going to spell it out for you, but there might be some wiggle room here around, very low power, or there's a line in there of sort of taking account of, which is what the legalistic term, which means this is important, you need to give it due consideration. But if you've got a really good reason to ignore it, then maybe. There's a lot of things on there and flexibility of country by country because of incumbents of fixed links or defense or something like that. So it might be that they're, without explicitly saying there's wiggle room, is they're leaving it up to people to realize that. And I'm not quite sure. It's probably a blend of all three.
So if I take a step back, and based on some of the stuff you wrote in the past, you seem to be skeptical that there is a genuine use case for this band, particularly due to the fact that indoor is going to be a big challenge for mobile.
Well, exactly. I mean, this is the point, is that, yes, in theory, you can construct an argument that AR, VR, and offloading of devices to some AI inferencing at the edge in the mobile network, maybe we need all that. But the issue is actually 6 gigahertz is a not a very good spectrum for doing that. Firstly, as you say, most use of things like AR, VR indoors, so you'll either be on Wi-Fi or you can have a dedicated indoor cellular if you want it, or private network. And the other thing is, for outdoor use, there will be hotspots, and maybe in a downtown urban area or a busy motorway junction if you buy into the autonomous vehicles things, or a football stadium, but it's not nationwide. And the idea that you're going to clear out all of the fixed links used for your broadcast industry and the perhaps defense and distributing emergency messages, it doesn't add up. And the other side to this is, and you know this as much as I do, is there's a problem with take up of gigabit services and fiber. And part of that is because you can buy a gigabit or even 10 gigabit fiber in some cases, but it doesn't work in each room of your house. You can't actually, well, whether you use it or not, the weak link is often the Wi-Fi, especially in MDUs and in industry as well. And think places like hotels, you need to have what are called non-overlapping channels. So you can imagine in an office block, you've got Wi-Fi access points on the floor above, the floor below. So you need to have enough spectrum to give it room to design that properly.
Yeah, dedicated mini bands for each floor or whatever.
Yeah, sort of. There's a bunch of design tools and parameters. So I'm not sure that this spectrum is particularly useful for 6G. We know that the demand for mobile traffic is flattening. And we also know there's a ton of improvements in spectrum efficiency in 5G and 6G coming down the line. So, every day I look at a press release about AI meets RAN or radio networks saying, oh, we've got an extra 10%, 30%, even 100% of efficiency out of it. Yeah. So it's not obvious that there's demand for this.
So what's really interesting to me with this is like, so I agree with you about the Wi-Fi, although to be fair, there have been huge improvements in distributed signal and meshing and stuff like that, which have made life a bit easier. But I mean, I remember when I lived in Hong Kong, you would look for your Wi-Fi network, and there'd be literally 50 other Wi-Fi networks within reach. So interference is a big issue in MDUs for sure. And particularly in some geographies or kind of dense urban areas. But the other thing that strikes me with this is that it seems like, again, much like parts of the DNA, it's fed by a sort of futuristic and very unconvincing, in my view, but I don't think you'll disagree with me, tech vision of a lot of applications that frankly are unproven at best, and probably 10 years down the line, if they ever emerge as such.
I completely agree. Interestingly, Hong Kong, you mentioned, that's the only place which has actually auctioned 6 gigahertz so far, and the results were fairly disappointing. It was pitched as a sort of pathfinder, but the cellular operators didn't pay very much for it, and at least one of them didn't participate. So yeah, I agree. There's a lot of this sort of, oh, it's going to be autonomous vehicles offloading to an AI inferencing node near the cell tower, maybe. But again, it's not proven. The other thing actually here is we've got, particularly in Europe, we're talking about consolidation of operators. Normally, when the mobile industry does these calculations, it says, well, we're assuming that there's going to be 4 operators and each of them need 200 megahertz or 100 and something. But actually, if we're going from 4 to 3 and 3 to 2 in a lot of markets, actually, the multiplier is going to be smaller, and there's going to be existing spectrum from whoever gets merged and acquired that needs to be divvied up. And a certain amount you could argue is for capacity, but there's going to be some spare as well.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe as a last nail on that coffin is, you can't, on the one hand, keep complaining that your capex is too high and the cost of your infrastructure is too high, and on the other hand, keep chasing for spectrum you might not actually need. It's kind of a weird position to be in.
I mean, I do a lot of stuff work on 6G, and the funny thing is, you listen to the mobile industry, and half the time, particularly in Europe, they say, "Oh, can we just have it as a software upgrade? We've gone through all this heavy lift, and we really don't want to do another big round of capex." And at the same time, they're like, "Well, can we have some extra spectrum?" I'm like, well, you're going to need to buy radios to use that extra spectrum.
Yeah, so that's capex again. Yeah, and pay for that spectrum, even if the trend that we're seeing is to pay less for spectrum. Okay, so that's really interesting. Cool.
One last point on that is I will probably come on to a bit of this, is arguably this is the policymakers giving a bit of a giveaway to the traditional telecoms industry, because they know that they're going to be irritated. There's not as much stuff they're going to get in the upcoming DNA as they'd hoped for. And that this is like a fairly low-cost giveaway because they can play the sovereignty card. Most of the Wi-Fi companies are US or Asian. There's a couple of small European Wi-Fi companies that frankly ought to speak up but don't. And this is almost like I think some politicians are viewing it as, we can throw a bone to the telecoms industry because they're going to gripe about, I don't know if it's IP interconnect or fair share or whatever.
Regulatory capture, Dean. Surely you're not suggesting that.
I've never heard the phrase.
All right. So let's move on to our next topic, which is one I've looked into and I'm not sure you have. So it's going to be an interesting bit of discussion there.
Yeah.
I have been, so for a while now, I've been aware of this, let's call it a concept at this stage. But the guy who came up with it has just now released a book, which full disclosure, I haven't read yet, but I've documented myself on it quite a bit, and I really do look forward to reading the book. So the concept is the concept of enshittification, which I think is just a glorious term for anything policy related, and it is policy related. So have you heard about this?
Yeah, I've heard the term. Yeah, I mean, it's been around for a couple of years. Yeah, it was like, from memory, all the sort of useless bits of a Google search page, which is just sort of advertising and promotional with this and that. And you're like, well, where's the actual stuff I want to see?
Yeah, I think it's actually a bit, it goes a bit further from that. Maybe that was the starting point. But so basically the guy who coined the term is Cory Doctorow, who's a really good both journalist, tech author, and fiction author for that matter. And so Cory published, I think a couple of years ago, a piece on enshittification, which he defined as basically every online service that you use is getting worse and worse. So it's not just the clutter, it's just the fundamentals are getting worse as well. So in other words, and I think I'm not the only one who made that connection, is, your Google searches are less relevant today than they were 10 years ago or 5 years ago. You get less of what you need and more crap. And not to point the finger at Google in particular, this is true across the board. And what's really interesting is that he is kind of, so yeah, the first thing I should say is there was a previous book that Cory Doctorow and an economist whose name now escapes me published, called Choke Point Capitalism, which basically conceptualized this notion, which has been known in economist circles for ages, but has kind of fallen out of favor, called monopsonies, which is basically when you are an intermediary that no one can circumvent. So you're not a monopoly in the sense that the retail end of that market has competition, but as an intermediary, basically everyone has to go through you, and that gives you a huge amount of market deciding power. And I think enshittification really builds upon that, in the sense that basically what allows the online services, he would probably call them platforms, although I'm not sure I want to use that term because it's a bit unclear to me what a platform is from a regulatory standpoint. But basically, there's a 3-step thing that he describes, and that I think gels quite well with our collective experience of how these things go, which is basically a new service comes up, and at first it needs to attract end users. So it's basically front-loaded to deliver huge quality and huge benefits to the end user. Once the end users are hooked onto that service, it basically generates revenues from turning to the other side of that, which is the providers of whatever value there is. So it can be advertising, or, you know, in the case of Uber drivers, it can be the drivers. In the case of you know, Amazon, it can be all of the third-party resellers. You know, so basically you then shift the value to these guys. So the value to the end users suffers a bit, while you shift the value to the kind of B2B side of the equation, right? And once both of these sides are hooked on, then all the value shifts to the shareholder, and basically the experience degrades for both of these, but everyone is hooked onto the platform, so they see very limited attrition. And so that's the theory of enshittification, basically.
Yeah.
And it relies on this kind of intermediary position in the market, where you're really basically creating an indispensable in-between that you control.
And presumably all of that is being repeated, reinvented, and frankly extended in the AI era. So I was hearing this week that, you know, OpenAI is adding a sort of essentially shopping GPT to ChatGPT, so it'll give you more advice on what to buy, and presumably that will get influenced at some point. And also the new hot thing on AI this week is Google Gemini 3, which then brings Google and everything else back into frame. I downloaded it, and you know, the permissions of basically we get all your data, and if you want to share your Gmail and everything else, that's great as well. So coupled with ever easier generation of content, what's called AI slop, presumably that just is enshittification on steroids.
Yes, I think so, although there is probably it's probably a bit early to see how it's going to play out in AI. It's certainly going to be kind of boosted by AI, that's for sure. The one thing that I find really interesting with Cory's writing is that he doesn't just describe the phenomenon, he really delves into what can we do about it. And one of the things that he says is, as individuals, there's a lot of small things that we can do, but that's not going to make any systemic changes. It's just going to make you feel better. But basically thinking that because you're using another search engine in Google, that's actually going to harm Google sufficiently that they think, oh, we need to improve our service. It's just not going to happen, because it's a trickle, and in order for it to happen, it would have to happen on a massive scale in a very short period of time, and that's very unlikely. And obviously, you know, the most egregious like culprits here are going to be Facebook and Instagram, where like users regularly say this service has become shit, but they stay on it because either they're dependent on it for business reasons, or, you know, all your friends are on it and you don't quite know how to move, and all of these things, right?
I mean, so, X is another one, form of Twitter,
obviously,
another great.
Obviously,
and LinkedIn is you know, it runs that risk. I see an awful lot of AI generated posts on LinkedIn. I use LinkedIn a lot. It's my main platform, and in some ways it's very good. But there's an increasing amount of, well, firstly its own native adverts, but it's just like engagement farming, and you can see it.
I think maybe this is a side note, but I think in part, I find it easier to spot in LinkedIn, or rather, it's just so visible that it's just so. I've actually been curating my kind of social graph quite a lot since I actively became engaged with LinkedIn again. So I'm regularly, just disconnecting from people whose content is obviously not kind of
useful
from the heart, if you see what I mean. It's just commercial content,
I
and
think
it delivers no value.
I think the curation aspect and taking ownership is for example, is really important. For example, on LinkedIn, you can make sure you see a given person's posts by sort of clicking the little bell for a notification every time they post. So you can prioritize, but it's a bit of hard work. I suspect that. Yeah, I suspect where we go with this is this word authenticity gets banded around a lot. I think there's going to be people who, I hate the term personal brand, and I suspect that let's call it reputation, becomes important. I also think, and this is perhaps self-serving, that in-person events become more important because you know what you're getting from whom, and it's a experience. It's the same thing that happened in the music industry, where it became very difficult for musicians to earn money online. You got wide distribution, but didn't get much unless you're in the top 0.1% on Spotify. But actually, their live performance revenue and merchandise revenue went up. So maybe you and I should be doing T-shirts and baseball caps.
Of the industry in general, yes. I mean, the music industry is not a very good example of people making a living out of there. I saw a band live last week, actually, and one of the things they said was, please buy our merchandise because the tour is just paying for itself. So basically, the cost of the tour is so high that we're barely breaking even. So our only actual revenue in this is the merchandise. And I thought it was really good of them to say this out loud and honestly, because it's rarely considered. So anyway, just to finish on this Cory Doctorow thing, because where I think is really interesting is he also looks at the policy angle and say, is there a systemic way that we can address this? And one of the things which has got me wondering, and I really need to get the book and read the book to go a bit more in depth on this, because I've heard him say this in interviews, was he said, Europe is where it's going to happen. And it's where it's going to happen because the idea of regulating online content is a lot more accepted in Europe than it is in the rest of the world, and particularly in the US. But also, and this is where maybe I'm a bit more or a bit less optimistic than he seems to be, but he was basically saying, with the whole tariff thing, Trump has effectively broadcasted to the rest of the world that the threat of don't touch our online services, otherwise we're going to put tariffs on you, is already been implemented anyway. So his view seems to be that that quid pro quo having disappeared, it's easier for European policymakers to now say, okay, we can go really gung-ho on this. And I have strong doubts about this, because if that had been the way it was going to play out, would have played out like this 6 months ago, and the trade negotiation would have been a lot harsher than it was. I think essentially Europe caved to Trump's requirements. And so I'm not saying the ship has sailed, but I think it would need another layer of, we'll treat you even worse than we have until now, for most of the European countries to break ranks with we need to appease the US kind of view.
I think the US thing is a bit of a straw man on that. I think the EU is realizing that it's over-regulated on a number of things, whether it's on the DMA, whether it's on the AI Act, and is now sort of slowly ratcheting that back. You saw that with some of the AI Act recently, and I think that it's not that yes, in part it's a response to the US, but it's also, frankly, it's innovators and developers. You can't regulate your way to having a cool European social network, for example.
No, but you could. I mean, this is a lot of this, and it would need time and me being better documented to go into some of the depth of this. But one of the things that he was arguing about was we have all, most of the developed world has basically accepted the idea that the tech product as it was provided was completely sanctuarized. So you can't jailbreak, you can't reverse engineer. All of these things are effectively illegal. And his argument was that's going to break at one point, because the imbalance between the tech companies and the rest of the world is going to become such that one country is going to say, actually, you know what? We don't care about this anymore. We're not sanctuarizing this anymore. That's his view, and I don't know that I necessarily agree with it, but it's an interesting angle to a discussion that rarely looks at law. It rather looks at regulation, right? But this is a legal protection. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm just going to drop the word TikTok and China in there and leave it at that, because that would put a completely different complexion on it.
Okay, well, I mean, I'm pretty sure we're going to revisit this sooner or later. But there was a last topic we wanted to briefly touch upon.
Yeah, and that's on. It's not a new trend, but the last week or so, both Verizon in the US and Telefonica in Europe have announced some significant additional job cuts. And this is an ongoing trend in telecoms. A lot of operators have shrunk down in size. You've seen it pretty much across developed economies. I'm not sure about emerging economies, probably still growing in Middle East and parts of Asia and Africa and LATAM. But it's to me, it's symptomatic of a few things. I think the first thing is as we move towards newer networks, whether that's 5G or whether it's fiber, you have less OPEX heavy existing infrastructure. So if you can switch off your copper network, then you don't need people in vans to go and maintain it, because fiber is light to touch. Then there's probably less people in terms of customer service, and you can probably blame some of that on AI, some of it on retail channel becoming less important. And also, frankly, we've just spent the last 10 years talking about virtualization and improved BSS, OSS, and everything else, about how that was going to reduce OPEX. And maybe that's now actually coming to fruition.
That's the key element to me is, I mean, obviously the softwareization leads to a complete shift in profiles. So first of all, you don't need the same kinds of people. So the generation of, it's not very nice of them to say it like this, but legacy telecom engineers, it's just the need for them is coming to an end to a large extent. And the need for more kind of IT oriented profiles to handle stuff that was done physically in the past and is now done virtually. That's a huge trend as well. It actually raises some questions also about possibly the opportunity to, geographically delocalize these skills, which might be something that's playing up in this as well, potentially. I don't know. But the point is, there's a lot more you can externalize or handle with different types of profiles. So that leads to, part of your workforce just being no longer necessary. The other thing is, as you said at the start, this is a long-term coming. And I think, by and large, AI and the latest trends are being copper switch off, etc., are also being used as, justifiers for policy that has been anticipated for a long time. So it's easier to make this palatable because of these, top news items that could possibly justify this. But I don't actually think AI is the key driver here. It's just one of many.
Yeah, I think there's certain roles which are more AI exposed, and sort of contact center is probably one of them. Maybe AI ops for network management, but that's a small proportion of overall headcount anyway. The other side to it is I see a lot of interest in telecoms and large telcos in refocusing from access network services, fixed broadband or mobile access, to things like AI and data center interconnect, which tend to be firstly different skills and often sort of lower headcount if you're the number of
and
people you need.
Scale.
But but the number of people to put a terabit a second between two data centers compared to 1,000 people getting a gigabit each to their house.
No, absolutely.
Yeah,
different scale entirely.
it's a different type of, it's more wholesale, more B2B, more infrastructure related perhaps, and less sort of individual services.
And I think possibly the not so rosy conclusion to this is that it's likely that this is a trend that's going to continue, and we're going to see this in other geographies, and especially from incumbent operators who probably have a lot more fat in their workforce layout than most of their competitors who basically started leaner.
And they need to come up with some way of being appealing to people leaving university or leaving school at the bottom, coming in to begin with. Now, it's possible that you could argue, oh, maybe they're going to be the developers that use telecom APIs in future, so they're in the telecom industry but not at the telco. But it's got to be a lot less attractive if you're whether it's electronic engineer or software engineer these days, working for a large telco than working for a startup or a cloud or AI company.
For sure.
Well, that's not a particularly cheery note to end on, but
no, it's not. But it's something that the industry, I think, is aware of and needs to be aware of, because it's happening, and again, if we tie this back to a bit of policy, there's been a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Blackmail on employment by incumbents in the past, and the fact is that even if no one is particularly cheerful, except possibly the shareholders, to announce this kind of thing, it's just going to happen.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also a corollary of consolidation, which that does seem to have sort of political support.
Indeed. All right.
Well, thank you very much for that.
So our next one is going to be the Christmas edition. We'll try and be more cheerful there.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll come up with some good stories and anecdotes, and maybe a silly hat or two as well. And as I think I'm supposed to say, smash that subscribe button and follow us on all the social media, which in ours are obviously very high signal to noise. And yes, I know that we are doing this as a free podcast, and at some point, we'll obviously, like everyone else in social media, try and monetize it. So get in contact with us and try and work with us, and we'll hopefully continue giving value and avoid this trend of enshittification.
Absolutely, that's what I was going to say. We'll try and generate revenue for ourselves without enshittifying the experience. All right.
Exactly. All right. Thanks,
have a good one, Dean. Bye.
Cheers.